The following podcast may be disturbing to those who support hatred, terrorism, anti-Semitism, and discrimination. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hi everyone, my name is Arsen Ostrovsky and I'm the CEO of the International Legal Forum. Welcome to our latest episode of How We Fought Against podcast, where we'll be discussing the upcoming Durban Conference at the United Nations. A lot more about that shortly, but before, let me introduce to you, please, today our very, very special guest, world-renowned attorney, Richard Heideman. Richard, you are not only a dear friend and partner on so many mutual battles, but truly you are truly one of the leading voices in the Israel community, and really internally that's at the forefront of combating anti-Semitism, of fighting for victims of terror, of fighting for the truth, of fighting against those who seek to malign and vilify the Jewish state. In fact, you've even defeated the likes of the Islamic Republic of Iran and Syria in the legal courts. That's just one example. If I had to read your entire CV, we would not have enough time, but I think that just goes as testament to really to how accomplished you are. But I'll try and be brief, and you will indulge me if I apologize if I do omit anything. But you are currently senior counsel at the leading Washington-based law firm of Heideman, Noodleman, and Kalik, where you have won really numerous and countless awards for your advocacy and for the firm's advocacy, including most recently being selected for the Super Lawyers list by Thomson Reuters. You're a prominent public speaker and advocate who has appeared on leading news sites, and your opinion pieces are really published regularly in the press. You're a noted author, including just published must-read book, which I was very fortunate to read over, The Bloody Price of Freedom, which I think this topic is very, very accurate on. And your book, which I think really traces in a meticulous way the battles that Israel has been forced to wage, not only in the battlefields of war, but in the courtroom as well, and the lessons we can draw from that. And of course, as a proud, unapologetic Zionist, which is probably what I admire most really about you. I know you've held leadership roles in many Jewish organizations, more than I even knew existed. And you've just finished an illustrious two-time term, I believe, as head of the American Zionist movement. But certainly last and not least, before we start, I know you also served, and this is really relevant to our discussion, as president of B'nai B'rith International for a number of years, including during 2001, where you served as the head of the delegation to the infamous Durban Conference in South Africa, which is what we'll be talking about. Richard, welcome, my friend. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Arsen. I'm honored to be here and to join with the members of the International Legal Forum, which has done masterful work, initially launched by Yifa Siegel, who's now the chief of staff at the Embassy of Israel here in Washington. So we're able to see her frequently, which is nice. And Arsen, we're so pleased that you've taken over as the chair and the CEO pursuant to her departure to Washington. And we congratulate the International Legal Forum for the important work it continues to do around the world on issues every day as they arise.
Thank you, Richard. Look, we're here to talk about Durban. You were there in person. I think the ostensible purpose of the Durban Conference was a positive one. It was a laudable one, to present a united front in the global fight against racism, xenophobia, but really descended into this sheer unbridled Jew hatred. It revived and the Zionism is racism slur, Israel is an apartheid, it had a Holocaust distortion, you name it. You were there in person. Take us back 20 years ago. What was it like being there? I mean, when you went there, what was your goal? What did you think would happen? And ultimately, what did you see happen before your eyes?
Well, Arsen, let's put it actually in context. As we know, Israel's independence, 1948, pursuant to the 1947 partition resolution, and Israel was admitted to the United Nations in 1949 and thereafter. B'nai B'rith International was actually admitted as the first Jewish international non-governmental organization at the United Nations in 1949, and has been leading activities for NGOs at the UN ever since, and at all aspects of the UN, in New York, in Geneva, in Paris, etc. So in that context, in 1975, as we all know, the United Nations adopted the Zionism equals racism resolution. And that created a terrible stir, and appropriately so, within the world Jewish community, because what's the worst thing you can call somebody? At least to me, the worst thing is a racist. That's the way I grew up. That's what I believe. You call somebody a racist, and then you paint racism as criminal, and you equate Zionism with racism. You're setting the stage at the official United Nations for Israel to be a pariah state, notwithstanding her acceptance into the family of nations. The Zionism racism resolution was in effect 10 years later, at the time of the UN conference to assess and appraise the status of women, which was held in Nairobi. And my wife, Phyllis, was named by B'nai B'rith International as a NGO delegate to the 1985 UN conference to assess and appraise the status of women. And we were briefed by the State Department. We were briefed by B'nai B'rith. We were briefed by the UN. And we went to Nairobi, I'm talking about Nairobi, 1985, with a full heart to stand up for the rights of women. And what we found there on the grounds of the NGO forum was not a conference about women, but a conference about Israel and Zionists and Jews as murderers, and as killers, and as people who take the blood of non-Jewish children and salvage it to be used. It was just a terrible anti-Semitic conference on the grounds in Nairobi. So fast forward to 2001, when we prepared to go to Durban for the UN conference on racism. On the one hand, we went with a full heart because the Zionism racism resolution had been abrogated by the UN previously in the previous decade. But the second intifada was already raging, because that started in 2000. So 2001, we go off to Durban, again, prepared by the State Department, prepared by the UN, and prepared by B'nai B'rith International. And we arrive in Durban, on the one hand, hopeful, but on the other hand, wary. Unfortunately, Arsen, our fears proved to be too well founded, because what we found on the ground in Durban, notwithstanding our intent to go there to battle racism, to battle inequality, to stand up for the rights of all people, including Israel and the Jewish people, what we found on the ground, Arsen, was a terrible hate fest, painted and pointed all about Israel and the Jews as murderers, equating Zionism as racism back there in the United Nations forum, castigating us physically, castigating us with placards, castigating us with shouting to us. It was a terrible, in fact, the worst anti-Semitic experience I've had in my life.
What was your response? I mean, when you saw that, your initial response, obviously this was something very jarring individually, and to see this kind of hatred, how did you respond at the time? when you were there? I mean, I know you led a walkout.
Well, not immediately, quite to the contrary. Because, as you already said, I was president of B'nai B'rith International at the time, and I was chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, United Nations Committee. I was designated as head of delegation for the Jewish organizations from the United States and for B'nai B'rith around the world that went to Durban. So what we did is we convened all the organizations. We brought in security that needed to be beefed up. We brought in some people we could talk to about the public relations debacle for Israel and the Jewish people, because everybody should have been better prepared. But we were assured in advance that this particular conference would not be a repeat of Nairobi. It wasn't a repeat of Nairobi. It was worse than Nairobi. In Nairobi, we gathered at the Nairobi Hebrew congregation there in Kenya. We had security. We were all housed in different places with security. That was in Nairobi in '85. In Durban, we did not have the same level of security, and people were concerned. But more than about security, we were concerned about what was going on the ground, the attitudes, the speeches, the lectures, the photographs, as I said, the placards, the demonstrations that were organized, well organized, and it blocked us out from many of the activities. When we actually got into the meeting that I called of all the Jewish organizations, we held it, as I always do, very democratically, an open forum to talk about issues, talk about ideas, talk about approaches. And I reminded everybody that when we had been in Nairobi, there was prepared a UN outcome document of the Nairobi conference, and we battled to keep Zionism, racism, or words negative about Israel and the Jewish people out of the UN document. And we were successful. Now, one of the reasons we were successful in Nairobi is we had the backing of the President of the United States. He had sent, President Reagan had sent Maureen Reagan, his daughter, as our head of delegation in Nairobi, along with Ambassador Alan Keyes, who was an experienced diplomat. And we worked all night long with delegations from around the world to explain to them the necessity to keep hate out of the UN outcome document of the Nairobi Conference on Women. When we therefore got to Durban and we began to work with the various committees that were working on the outcome document, what we found was that it was pre-cooked. There had been UN preparatory conferences in various parts of the world, in Latin America, in Europe, but there had also been one in Tehran. They came not just full of hate, but they came well prepared to Durban. And they came with a document that was flush with negative attitudes, negative statements, not only about Israel and the Jewish people, that were blatantly anti-Semitic. And so we met with the US ambassador, we met with the Israeli ambassador, we met with other ambassadors, and we concluded that a red line for us was the UN outcome document. If we could get the hate toward Israel and the Jewish people out of the outcome document, then we would stay for the full conference, as we did in Nairobi. In Durban, however, that red line was really a bold barrier against us, because the outcome document, as I already said, was pre-cooked. It was put together, and everything was just a camouflage for what already was going to roll out as what's now called the Durban Program, PROGRAMME. And that Durban Program is full of attitudes and not just insinuations, but statements. And we were unable to get out of it the references to Zionism, racism. We were more importantly unable to include that anti-Semitism is racist. We were unable to include that anti-Semitism is full of hate and bigotry and intolerance. What really we found, therefore, in our meeting of all the Jewish NGOs is we had allies in the non-Jewish NGOs, we had allies in governments, and we felt that we needed to take a stand that unless the outcome document, the Durban program, was going to be cleansed of the hate toward Israel and the Jewish people, we would walk out en masse. And we did, and arm with Lord Janner from the UK, from the United Kingdom, the Board of Deputies of British Jews. We led the walkout, he and I, and all the Jewish organizations indeed walked out of Durban. The US ambassador walked out, the Israeli ambassador walked out. We never really got a clear picture of which other ambassadors walked out, but we left the conference. And there's an end note to that. The following day, above the fold, in the official UN Forum newspaper, was plastered the photograph of our walkout. And I truthfully don't recall the headline, but it was something like Jews walk out of UN conference. The fact of the matter is this conference had been called to battle racism and hatred and bigotry and intolerance, and instead it promoted it. And what we found after Durban, the hatred was so embedded and widespread worldwide that the seeds that had been planted were growing already rapidly into bushes and now trees over the last 20 years, following a program that included boycotts and included the launching of the BDS, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, and focusing on diplomatic warfare against Israel and calling upon groups to hit the college campuses and teach about the hate of Israel, the hate of the Jewish people, and to make it acceptable for people to be anti-Semitic. And 20 years later, we see what we have.
It's something I definitely want to touch on, and I'm glad you led in that direction. Sort of fast forward to 20 years later, and looking at the ripple effects of Durban, looking back into the seeds of hate in 20 years ago, they were planted, and how do we see them expressed today? How do we see them expressed in the field, in diplomatic field, and certainly in the legal and the UN arena, and in the overall, I think, in the war of narratives, in which Zionism is being outrageously maligned, and the apartheid slur is being regurgitated and used at ease, and the whole BDS movement was really, the modern BDS movement was really born. It was born in sin, but born in Durban in 2001. How do you see, fast forwarding the last 20 years, the ripple effects from Durban?
I think we should put it in quick context, because let's remember that right after Israel's declaration of independence, there was launched against her by the Arab League countries a war. We call it the War of Independence. Another war in 1956, another war in 1967, another war in 1973. And not having defeated Israel on the battlefield, the Arab League really moved heavily toward diplomatic warfare. So 73 war, 75, the Zionism racism resolution, the full launching of the Arab boycott that led to the United States enacting legislation that dealing with the Arab boycott and putting it under the supervision, oversight of it under the US Department of Commerce, pursuant to legislation in 1979, and countries have been assessed fines and have been castigated by the United States government since that legislation, all the way up until recently. With the period in the 80s and in the 90s and in the 2000s, we also saw a shift from battlefield warfare, adding on top of the diplomatic warfare. We then saw, through the work of the PLO, we saw all of the terror attacks, people being killed. It led right up to the first intifada, led to the second intifada, which, as I said, was already raging at Durban, with suicide bombings, with attack on buses, with attack on pizza parlors, with killing of young people indiscriminately, as a means of attempting to achieve a political gain. When you got to Durban, therefore, all of this was going on, and it moved, therefore, to the electronic intifada. It moved to the outreach, as I've already said, to the college campuses. It moved to the university professors, to the curriculum. It moved to more than just painting Zionism as racist. It moved through the UN General Assembly in 2003 to the adoption in the latter part of 2003 of the resolution referring to the International Court of Justice, the legal question, seeking an advisory opinion, because that's all that the General Assembly can request, seeking an advisory opinion on the legal consequences of Israel's construction of what was referred to as the apartheid wall, rather than understanding that it was a terrorism prevention security fence, 96% approximately of which is a fence, and 4 to 6% of which is a concrete barrier, the goal of which is to fence out the terrorists, the goal of which is to stop the attacks during the Second Intifada. It wasn't built as an apartheid wall. It was built to protect Israel and the Jewish people and all of Israel's citizens. What greater obligation does a country have other than to stand up for and protect the safety and security of her citizens? So in 2004, the International Court of Justice handed down its advisory opinion, which, as you well know, Arsen, literally painted Israel in an advisory capacity, but made it clear that in the opinion of the ICJ, Israel is in violation of international law, and building the settlements issue rather than recognizing those communities as parts of ancient Israel, building that issue as well and rolling it all together so that during the last part of the 2000s and in the last decade, there has been this grand momentum using a combination of Arab League hatred, diplomatic warfare, terror, threats, refusal to come to the table unless they get what they want as preconditions, and blaming Israel as everything, and painting the Palestinians, who deserve to have their own state, who deserve to have their own peoplehood, but painting Israel as literally the apartheid, racist, criminal state. And when you have all of that rolling together, it has changed the course of public opinion against Israel. While most Americans still support Israel, on the college campuses, there is a great disaffection. And the professors, some of whom are on the payroll of Iran and Iranian entities, some of whom are on the payroll of NGOs who are funded by foreign governments that are against Israel. I want to pause, though, and paint a slight hope, because the Abraham Accords is the first big change since the signing of the agreement between Israel and Egypt and the signing of the agreement between Israel and Jordan, 2 Arab League countries. For 4 Arab League countries in 2020 to sign the Abraham Accords, to sign peace agreements with Israel, to begin trade. And these are countries that were on the US Department of Commerce list of sanctioned countries pursuant to the illegal Arab boycott. I'm hopeful that the growth of real trade, the growth of real relations, the growth of respect and tolerance will lead to some benefits as we enter this next phase.
I'm glad, I'm happy that you do have some semblance of optimism, which I certainly share in this regard. I think it really has been in very many respects, I think, a paradigm shift in the region, in Israel's acceptance in the Arab world, and certainly newfound allies of ours in this really mutual fight in so many ways. So I'm happy that it's something that you've certainly pointed out, and something I think for us to look forward to, including as we combat and fight back against this hatred. Richard, I wanted to ask you, I mean, we had a war here in May, as you very well know, and we have a ceasefire now. Thankfully, the ceasefire is holding. But as I'm looking around Jewish communities in the United States, in Canada, across Europe, many parts of the world, there's no ceasefire there. The hatred, the violence against Jews, the blatant beating up in broad daylight in the streets is in full view in the middle of New York City, in the middle of Montreal, on the streets of Europe. It's before our eyes. You saw what happened in London with a convoy of cars, for example. It's truly jarring stuff. I think in many ways it's figures we have not seen, I think, since the end of the Shoah in a lot of respects. But the way I look at it from my perspective, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. This didn't come out of nowhere. Would you put a direct correlation between Durban 2001 and what we're seeing today in 2021 in the violence we're seeing directed against not only Jews as individuals, but also against Israel as the Jewish state? Is there a direct correlation to Durban?
I think there's a direct correlation, but we have to, again, go back and look at history. Let's just flash back 100 years. 100 years. Hitler developed the Nazi manifesto, 25-point manifesto, full of hate, targeting the Jewish people. In the 30s, the Nuremberg laws, castigating and separating and isolating Jewish businesses and Jewish people and Jewish community, mandating the wearing of identification stars as they headed toward the Shoah. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, the end of the 30s. This is all before the war started. Boycotts of Jewish businesses. After the Shoah, after the end of World War II, after we lost not just 6 million Jewish souls, but documented now of 17 million people. Evidence that's been gathered by the International Tracing Service, documents at Bad Arolsen that has been digitized, and I'm told there's 100 million documents now about people and how they were treated, when they were killed, when they were moved. Amazing evidence that has to really be fully examined. We have to learn from history. We didn't put a stop to it because either we didn't take it seriously, we thought everything would be okay, the Shah still mentality, or Yi beseder, everything will be okay. Well, it's not okay today, and it's not just because of Durban. I don't think anybody took seriously enough the Arab League Compact, 1944, and the countries that built their mandates against Israel, not just refusing relations and refusing to recognize, but spewing hate and sponsoring terror organizations, as Iran and Syria do today, the worst sponsors of hate in the world, and the proliferation of sponsored terror organizations, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And I'm sorry to say it, but most of the world does very little to put a stop to any of those terror attacks. Is it because those terror attacks justifiably target Israel, target Jews? And is that acceptable? It is not acceptable. And I'd like to suggest to you, Arsen and the members of the International Legal Forum, that as I've said in previous matters, we have to adopt as a people, as a community, a zero tolerance policy. We have to report, highlight, shine a light on every single incident where litigation can be initiated. It should be initiated. Where we can complain to governments, we must file those complaints. Where we can get to editorial boards, where we can get to ambassadors, where we can get to prime ministers, presidents, and foreign ministers around the world to change their attitudes, to change their votes, we have to do so. Because what you really have now, through the UN, notwithstanding some hopeful signs we're seeing in vote changing, what you see is a different form of state-sponsored hate. Just like the Nuremberg laws was state-sponsored, legalized hate toward the Jewish people. At the UN, through the UN Human Rights Council, through other activities, including the resolutions at the UN General Assembly, it is essentially state-sponsored hate. And it seems to many like it's okay for them to say they love us and we are best friends, but then to vote against us in courts, in the court of public opinion, in the UN venue, and it all has to stop. And it's only going to have to stop when our people become better educated, better informed, more activated, more cohesive, more unified in our determination to build again a better future for our people and our nation state of Israel. And we have to start with all generations, not just the younger generation. We have to go back to the grandparents who remember, or in their memory. We have to evoke their memory with the children and the grandchildren and the next generations and get them all re-incensed that this is serious. Jews are being kicked out of elevators because they're Jews. They're being stabbed because they're Jews. They're being shot at because they're Jews. They're being beaten because they wear a kippah. And only we can stand up for ourselves and gather in the allies, the Christian allies, allies around the world, including Muslims who have come to our aid and our partnership. But somebody has to lead this. And the fact of the matter is there's a dearth of leadership. Lots of people are busy raising money for the overheads of their organization, but their organizations are not developing real solid plans of action. And I conclude with this. It seems to me the International Legal Forum has the ability, with trained, motivated, brilliant lawyers around the world, to be a focal point from which we develop this plan of action coordinated worldwide to stand up against hate, bigotry, intolerance, anti-Semitism, and the hatred that is pointed toward Israel, Zionism, us being in our ancestral homeland, and accordingly pointed at the Jewish people. The March of the Living says never means never. Other organizations are saying enough is enough. We have to all work together, put our political differences aside, and concentrate on this hatred and put it down, because hatred leads to broken glass. Hatred leads to laws, and hatred leads to beatings, killings, and decimation of life. It's intolerable. The seeds are there now, and they weren't just planted at Durban, but they were sanctioned at Durban. They were embraced in an official UN program. And the UN convened in 2009 a Durban Review Conference, and in 2011 a 10-year conference, and now we're coming up on the 20-year conference that's going to take place in barely a month at the United Nations. Let us all stand together against this hatred and tell the countries that are not going to attend Durban, kol hakavod, toda rabah. And for those countries that are still not yet announcing that they're not going to Durban, we need to go to them and get them not to go. Do not dignify this hate. It cannot continue.
Richard, I honestly could not think of a more inspiring and powerful advocate for the Jewish people, for the state of Israel, for our basic freedoms of truth, of democracy. What you just said, I think, was a clarion call to action for all those who not only our fellow Jewish brothers and sisters, but really all those that support the state of Israel, that stand for the truth, that stand for justice, that stand against hatred, racial discrimination, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and intolerance. I think you've offered a lot of wise, inspiring advice to all of us, from standing up for speaking out the truth, to seeking alliances, to being unapologetic about what we believe and who we are, and needing to fight this hatred at every corner, in every courtroom, and every place, with all our means and with all our might. Richard, thank you truly from the bottom of my heart. You are a friend, a mentor, a partner, not just of someone I admire personally, but there's International Legal Forum considers you, a cherished ally. Thank you truly for everything that you do, that you've done, and that I know that you will continue to do and fight and be at the forefront. Thank you.
Thank you very much.